Hey there, welcome to another episode of Digging In. I wanted to do this, work through this text because I haven't done a narrative in a little while, and I think learning to read and interpret biblical narrative it's an art. It's an underappreciated art because a lot of times we read and we look at biblical narratives and maybe we don't always know, we just kind of read them as kind of interesting stories, but we don't really always know exactly how to interpret them. So I wanted to take the time and just do a short little kind of walk through a narrative that we're going to be looking at here at Sunny Slope as part of our series on virtue to vice. So I'm going to put the text up on the screen. We are looking at a passage from the book of Daniel. This is part of our series that is moving us from vice to virtue. And that's really just a way of saying we're looking at some of the sort of the key sins that people struggle with, and then how to move from there to godly living instead. And one of the key sins, in fact, some have said it's the sort of the chief of the seven deadly sins, is that of pride, or it's maybe better understood as vainglory. And there's a story in the Bible in Daniel chapter 4 in which a king of Babylon named Nebuchadnezzar, actually exhibits all of this. So um, we're going to look at this story here. And my goal here is really just rather than kind of break this down clause by clause, it's really to look at this, let's say, movement by movement. When you're looking at a story, you're looking for a plot line. You're looking for the problem or the conflict that arises, then what is done to address that conflict, and then finally, how do things return to a new normal? That's a simple kind of plot line, and that's what we should be looking for. The goal is not so much to look at characters to imitate. It's not so much to look at, how do we need to be like this person, but it's more to look at what is God doing in the story. What is the problem? Where do we see human sinfulness? How does God respond to that? How does he address it? So we start off with the text, Daniel chapter 4, and we read this verse 28 is kind of an introductory verse. It just kind of sets the stage. It actually forms a bridge from the previous text to this text, and then we read at the end of the 12 months, he was walking on the roof. This kind of sets the scene for us. So this is, in some ways, this is like the setting. It just kind of puts us where he's at, what he's doing. But then the conflict is introduced here in verse 30 because the king says something. He says, "Is this not the great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal resident?" So right away, the conflict is introduced into this story. And the problem that we're seeing, the problem that is going to present an issue or something that has to be worked through for Nebuchadnezzar, is this sense of pride that he has. Is this not the great Babylon which I have built? And so that introduces the problem. And now we see, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. So God is intervening and responding to this. Um, and we'll just separate out God's speech here for just a moment. And we'll read God's speech here, and it goes on to about the end of verse 32. And essentially, this is God's judgment on Nebuchadnezzar's claim. He makes his claim to greatness, and God responds to it. And then, and so now the conflict is intensifying because Nebuchadnezzar has made this claim, but that claim is in conflict with God's claim. Now, you have to know a little of the background of Daniel. In a lot of ways, that is a key theme in the book of Daniel, is this conflict between worldly kingdoms and God's kingdom. So you don't know that unless you're really familiar with the book of Daniel, but this whole conflict actually fits really well with that overarching theme of the book. And so immediately the word is fulfilled. He was driven. So God makes a prophecy. He pronounces judgment. You would be made to eat grass like an ox. In other words, you're going to be humbled. You think this kingdom is yours. You're focusing on your greatness. It's going to be taken away from you. So we kind of see then the word is fulfilled, and he eats, the prophecies. He ends up in the field with his hair long and his nails like bird claws and so on. at the end of the day, so that kind of represents this sort of building or this intensifying conflict. And then we're kind of wondering, how is this? So the problem in the story isn't so much Nebuchadnezzar goes mad and loses his mind. The problem is, what is he going to do about his pride? The going out into the field is the judgment upon that. How will he respond? And then we read in verse 34 exactly what happens. He lifts his eyes to heaven. My reason returned to me. I bless the Most High. So you see, there's a change there. Now, instead of blessing himself, he's blessing God, and he's giving glory to him. Um, and then we kind of go down all the inhabitants, and to hear verse 36. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. So God is restoring Nebuchadnezzar. But so in some ways, this marks the I would say maybe this we could put this kind of on the same level, because in some ways this is the climactic moment, and maybe this is the actually the beginning of kind of things returning to normal, because in some ways Nebuchadnezzar is being restored to his position. But what do we actually see? The key difference here is in verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for his works are right, his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. So you can kind of see, and I sort of lay it out this way on purpose, you kind of see the rising action and then the climactic moment here where Nebuchadnezzar realizes God has humbled him. Nebuchadnezzar realizes that God has to get all the glory. And in that moment, then he returns, he gives praise to God and gives glory to God. And then at the end, we move back to Nebuchadnezzar honoring and extolling the King of heaven. That's a contrast to here at the beginning, because what is he doing? He's honoring and extolling himself. And so the story moves, the plot line of the story moves from extolling self to extolling God, worshiping self, worshiping God. And that's, of course, the sin of pride and or vainglory moving to humility and praise. So we kind of see that pattern there. There's a lot more that we could say about the narrative, and of course that's where good exegesis is going to come in. We're going to do a more in-depth study. But for now, I just wanted to kind of walk through what's the basic way of looking at and reading a narrative text in the Bible. We're not so much paying attention to simple moral lessons. There are moral conclusions that we can draw, but we want to be careful that we aren't simply turning the Bible into a collection of stories that just teach us good and bad. We have to, there's more, and that will come through as we dig more into the text. But for now, thanks for joining me on this episode of Digging In. We'll see you next time.